Yes, my name is Cord Egan. I'm the Director of External Relations and Communications for Renison University College. And welcome to the One Sky Overall Community Speaker Series brought to you by Renison University College and the Waterloo Public Library. And we'd like to thank the Waterloo Public Library for all their support in this series. Renison University College, affiliated with the University of Waterloo, was established in 1959. Students of Renison earn University of Waterloo degrees. Our original founders established as the college's motto the Latin phrase sed coelum solum, one sky over all. This phrase has evolved over the years to encompass all that we do. Renison believes deeply in contributing to a world in which social justice, diversity, and equity are not aspirations but realities, and our programs reflect. We believe that barriers exist where ignorance and misunderstanding prevails. We aim to collapse those barriers through programs that improve our understanding of diverse languages and cultures, social and economic environments, and questions related to gender, spirituality, and a shared sense of belonging. Renison offers undergraduate degree programs in social development studies, honors arts, and honors arts and business. Our postgraduate programs include a Bachelor of Social Work and a Master of Social Work with a focus on health. Renison offers classes for undergraduate students who choose to minor in Applied Language Studies, East Asian Studies, or Studies in Islamic and Arab cultures. We also have courses that count towards a major or minor in religious studies. Renison also has a wide selection of community and professional education programs so you can experience culture, engage in language learning, or explore spirituality through a dynamic selection of events, workshops, courses, and programs at your own pace. I thank you for your interest in this series. Tonight, I am honored and admittedly a bit scared to introduce our speaker, Dr. Douglas E. Cowan. Douglas E. Cowan is a professor of religious studies and social development studies at Renison University College. In addition to numerous articles and essays, he has written a number of books on religion and popular culture, including Sacred Terror, Religion and Horror on the Silver Screen, Sacred Space, The Quest for Transcendence in Science Fiction, Film, and Television, and Magic, Monsters, and Make-Believe Heroes, How Myth and Religion Shape Fantasy Culture. He is also the author of America's Dark Theologian, The Religious Imagination of Stephen King, which is the only full-length treatment of religion in King's horror fiction. In addition to Bodies at a Place, Sex, Horror, and the Religious Imagination, the book he'll be talking about this evening, he is working on Fighting Spirit, Myth, Religion, and the Martial Arts, and America's Reluctant Prophet, The Religious Imagination of Philip K. Dick. In his spare time, I'm surprised there is any, he practices Shidokan karate, rides a big black motorcycle, and hangs out with his wife, Joey, and his black lab, Teddy. Please welcome Dr. Douglas E. Cowan.
Thanks, Court. I appreciate the introduction, and it's nice to be here. I hope everybody can see me. This is very weird for me, because I'm used to being in a room and being able to read what's going on in the room. So basically it feels like I'm kind of talking to myself, as it were, but I'll trust that there are at least 4 or 5 of you out there. I'd like to begin by thanking Nancy Yee from the Waterloo Public Library for inviting me and for making this happen. I think in these weird, strange times that I fear are going to get weirder and stranger before they get better, having something like this is sort of an extraordinary way to keep connections. So thank you very much for that. I'd also like to thank Court Egan and Carrie Cornies at the External Relations Department at Renison for being a part of this. And I'm particularly glad that Court's here tonight. And I'm glad that you're here tonight, that you had, nothing else you wanted to do on a Tuesday night. So I don't have a prepared text that I'm going to read, because I can't imagine anything more boring than somebody actually reading an hour's worth of prepared text into a camera. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit about a few things that relate to this book that I'm working on right now, Bodies Out of Place, Sex, Horror, and the Religious Imagination. So welcome to the weirdness, and I'm glad that you're here. I thought what I would do, since many of you may not know who I am, you may not know me beyond the court's introduction, I thought I would tell you a little bit about how I got to write about religion and horror, which is to say, how I got to the place where I can watch horror movies and read scary novels and call it work. Because I didn't start out writing about horror. I wasn't a horror fan when I was a kid. I was more Star Trek than Satan's slaves, okay? I was, as a kid, I was pretty easily startled. My parents let me stay up and watch the first episode of Star Trek when I was about 8 years old, and with the salt-sucking creature, and that image is still burned into my brain. At 15, they let me go see The Exorcist, which I thought was a tremendously bad parenting decision, because even to this day, when I screen The Exorcist in class, or I talk about it, when I hear that, that Tubular Bells theme, that The Exorcist theme, the hair still goes up on the back of my neck, because that movie it did me in. I wanted to leave, but I was in a very small town. It was dark out. There's no way I was going to walk home. I mean, let's be clear. The devil now knew that I knew, and the jig was up. So I was not much of a horror fan. When I started my academic career, I was writing mostly about new religious movements, what are colloquially and inappropriately and often inaccurately called cults. So I would write about modern paganism, and I would write about Mormonism, and I would write about Scientology, and I would do things like that. I also did some work on religion and the internet. But sometimes you have to be open to what the universe has to say to you. And I can actually pinpoint the moment when my intellectual life changed. It was Halloween, right about this time of the year. Right about this time of the year, 15 years ago, 2005, I was living in Kansas City, Missouri, and I had the flu. Maybe it was the man flu, I don't know. But I had the flu. And in Kansas City, one of the local television stations was running a Hellraiser marathon. I think that Nancy's going to put up an image. Now, maybe you have seen this image that I'd seen them. I'd gone to the video stores and I'd seen Hellraiser 1 and Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser 3 and all the rest of them. And I sort of thought the image was sort of interesting, but I'd never seen the movies. So I decided, mostly because I was too lazy to get off the couch and change the channel, I decided to watch them, and they were, playing them in order, as often happens in, there it is, Hellraiser. He'll tear your soul apart. And so I was watching these films, and the more I watched them, the more I realized that there was a mythology that was being built here that spoke very concretely, not to the scared, 8-year-old or 15-year-old who'd gone to see The Exorcist, but to the sociologist of religion who also happened to be interested in popular culture. And I started realizing that these movies are about the religious imagination. Here's the moment that changed the direction of my life. So, Nancy, if you can put up the next image, the one of Pinhead. This is the Cenobite, the Hell Priest Pinhead, played by the inimitable Doug Bradley. And in the fourth of these films, the fourth Hellraiser, it's called Hellraiser Bloodline. Yes, it's the one that takes place in space. And yes, it's the one that everybody hates. Get over it. There is this moment when the Cenobite, the Pinhead, the Hell Priest, comes on screen. and looking like this, and the human character on screen kind of scrambles backwards, and he goes, "Oh my God!" And in that inimitable Doug Bradley voice, Pinhead looks out at the audience and says, "Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?" And it is not too much to say that that moment changed the direction of my intellectual life. Because I swear, the whole sort of structure for my first book on religion and horror, Sacred Terror, fell into place. So maybe, Nancy, as I talk about these, you can sort of put up each of the book covers that Court already mentioned. So the first book I wound up writing out of this, I even designed the cover, I'm proud to say, Sacred Terror, Religion and Horror on the Silver Screen, because I'd read a couple of things about religion and horror. And one I read was that they said this was by actually a religious studies scholar, who said you don't actually expect to find religion in a horror movie. And I thought to myself, dude, you just haven't been paying attention. And then there was another guy I read, a guy named Brian Stone, who said religion has nothing useful to teach us about religion. Horror movies have nothing useful to teach us about religion. So the first guy I just thought was wrong. He hadn't been paying attention. Stone, I just thought was wrong. I mean, he's just straight up wrong. Because what I did with religion and horror on the silver screen is I started asking myself, well, okay, why do we find so much religious iconography? Why do we find so many religious characters? Why do we find so many religious settings? Why do we find rituals and sacred books and ceremonies and priests and all the rest of it as almost a set piece part of horror if it's got nothing to tell us, right? So I looked at horror movies. I watched a bunch of them. And I came up with this book. That sort of led me down this path. The next one I decided to work on was Sacred Space. Now, Sacred Terror was about religion and horror on the silver screen. Sacred Space is about the religious imagination, what I call the quest for transcendence. You can flick the next one up, Nancy. Thank you. The Sacred Space is about the quest for transcendence in science fiction. So if religion and horror asks the question, what if we're wrong about the way the world works? And I'll say more about that in a bit. Sacred Space asks the great what if questions. What if we could travel faster than light? What would that do to our sense of religion? What if we met alien species and they had religions of their own that were very different from ours? What would that tell us about our own sense of the greaterness of the universe, if you want to put it that way? Because stories are what make us human, in my view. Lots of people think differently, but in my view, I mean, think about it. We share 98.5-ish% of our DNA with bonobos and chimps, right? We share 95% of our DNA with mice. Hell, we share 60% of our DNA with bananas. So all of the differences, DNA-wise, genetically, are wrapped up in that small little piece. So what is it that makes us human? I think it's what I have come to call properly human questions. Keep that in mind. Just put a pin in it. So I do horror, I do science fiction. Then the natural thing to do was do fantasy, which came with a book called Magic, Monsters, and Make-Believe Heroes, How Myth and Religion Shape Fantasy Culture, which, by the way, is my favorite cover of all of the ones that I've done. You can put that one if you like, Nancy. So this book looked not at horror, not at science fiction, but all sort of fantasy culture, and not just movies, not just television, but YouTube and games and cosplay, and why playing Dungeons and Dragons is part of the exercise of the religious imagination. finally, I wrote this book called, I mean, I said I wasn't a horror fan. I'm honest about that, because I was never really a Stephen King fan. But I was meeting with a publisher a few years ago, and I pitched her an idea, and she said, "Nah, I guess that's okay. What else you got?" And I said, "Well, I've always kind of wondered if there was much, religiousness going on in Stephen King." She went, "Ooh, you should write me something about that." So I bought in Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Atlanta, I bought the first Stephen King novel I'd read in literally 30 years. Read it on the plane home. And lo and behold, a year later, it turned into a book called America's Dark Theologian, The Religious Imagination of Stephen King. What I've gained over writing all of these and thinking about all of these, and these are not statements of the way I think things are. Each of these are kind of like waypoints on a map. So you can put the Stephen King book up, please, Nancy. Each of these are, there it is. Each of these are sort of waypoints along a map of my thinking about what the religious imagination means. Because you'll notice America's Dark Theologian is not called Religion and Stephen King or Religion in Stephen King. I mean, it is for damn sure not called The Gospel According to Stephen King. You know what? If you want to know what I think about books like that, you should check out Magic Monsters and Make Believe Heroes, but prepare yourself because it ain't pretty. This is about the religious imagination, which I think is something that is endemic to humankind, regardless of whether we worship particular gods or not. So I don't have an image for Bodies Out of Place, Sex, Horror, and the Religious Imagination, because that book is in process. We're not at the point where we're going to have a cover for it yet. I didn't want to presume to know what it would look like, and I certainly wanted to keep this talk, safe for work-ish. So what I want to talk about tonight is sort of the waypoints that Bodies Out of Place is leading me towards. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by religion. I'm going to talk a little bit about sex. I know that is why you're all here. I understand that there's a pretty good crowd, and thank you for that. And I just suggested to Nancy in court that the takeaway from this should be that whatever somebody is talking about, sex ought to be in the title somewhere, because, why the hell not? Then I'm going to take you on a little tour through 3 chapters in Bodies Out of Place. I'm going to talk about sacrificial bodies. I'm going to talk about sacred flesh. And I'm going to talk about sexualizing the dangerous other. The way I tend to write is all of my books, I tend to start each chapter with a little story, with a little vignette, and then sort of unpack it from there. So what I'd like to offer you tonight is a little vignette from each of those. Now, one of the guy who hired me for my first job in Kansas City, a man named Gary Eversole, one of the things he taught me when I was, so you have your PhD and then you actually go learn how to be a professor. He taught me everything is grist for our mill. And that's something that I've tried to carry through and honor in this. So you will see all kinds of different ways of realizing the religious imagination in real time in these 3 little vignettes. I hope that's okay. I don't know if it isn't. We are where we are. So first, I'd like to talk about what I mean by religion and the religious imagination. Now, one of the things about religion, if I ask people what they mean by religion, there's a very particular thing that happens in people's brain. It's called, in social psychology, it's called the availability heuristic. What that means is your brain kind of flips through your mental Rolodex and picks out an image of something that you recognize, that you can readily recognize. So if I say religion and you are a church goer, you go to a temple, you go to masjid, you go to some house of religious observance with any kind of regularity at all. That's the image that's going to come to your mind because it is the most available. Does that make sense? So the problem with that is people tend to think other religions have to look like theirs. And if they don't look like theirs, then they're not really religions. So you get all these definitions that say religion is that which worships a supreme being. Well, not all religions worship supreme beings. That, religion is that which worships a single God. Well, not all religions worship single gods. Not all religions worship gods at all, right? There are atheist religions, and they're still religions in my view. Some people argue they're philosophies, but we can agree to disagree. So, Nancy, if you could put up the William James slide, please. And I wrote this down because it's been my go-to for 15 years. Now, James gets a bad rap because of other, some things that he's said, which, we've outgrown. But I think that this quote, this is how one of the two ways that William James defines religion. He said that it's the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmonious adjustment thereto. Now, that definition has tremendous utility for the kind of work that I do, because if you'll notice, it doesn't say anything about gods, for example. It says the belief that there is an unseen order. All that means is that this is not all there is. Maybe it does look the way evangelical Christians imagine it. Maybe it does look the way Buddhists or Hindus imagine it. Maybe it does look the way Scientologists imagine it. Doesn't matter. The issue is there is the belief that there is this thing larger than ourselves that is behind us or above us or beside us. It is an unseen order. But more than that we are somehow in relationship with that unseen order, that whatever we consider our supreme good, whether that's salvation or a good crop or, not to have something terrible happen to us, whatever we consider our supreme good, that somehow that unseen order has relevance and that we must find a way to be in harmony with us. Now, for me, there are a variety of different reasons that I think this is useful, but in terms of horror, the principal utility of this is what I call, it gets us away from what I call the good, moral, and decent fallacy. Because a lot of definitions of religion rely on some notion of goodness, morality, and decency as part of the definition. If something is good, moral, and decent, it is religious. If somebody does something that we don't consider good, we don't consider moral, we don't consider decent, that can't be religion. It must be false religion. It must be a cult. It must be, demons or something, right? Real religion is good, moral, and decent. The problem is there's not a scrap of evidence in all of human history to demonstrate that that's the case. Now, are there nice people? Are there good people who are good by virtue of their religious belief? Sure. Chances are they'd be good anyway. But consider this. Just cast your mind back just over what you know. Think of all the horrible things that you have heard or seen or read done in the name of this God or that. And maybe it's a part of your tradition and you've pointed at it and gone, heretic, non-believer, whatever. Ask yourself this. What do you think those people are saying when they look back at you? Do you know what I mean? Does it make sense? Religion is always and everywhere perspectival. It depends on the perspective of the person. Somebody who is doing something that I might consider absolutely horrific, and doing so not only in the name of their God, but at the behest of their God. I'm the one they look at and figure, well, there's another unbeliever. The nice thing about, or the useful thing about James's definition is it allows us to separate this idea of goodness, morality, and decency and consider things that we might not want to face in terms of religion as religion. Now, what I call the religious imagination is slightly different. And what you're going to see when we get to these little vignettes is not so much religion as the religious imagination at work. All religion is part of or extrudes from or is a product of the religious imagination. Think of them as islands that come up out of a vast black sea of infinity, to speak with H.P. Lovecraft for a moment. But just like islands that come up out of the sea, not all products of the religious imagination emerge into real life as full-blown religions. Doesn't mean that we are not still looking at the religious imagination. Finally, before I move on to sex, I want to talk about religious questions. I think these are misnamed religious questions. You know the questions I mean. If you say, what are the great questions of religion? You know, who are we? Where did we come from? What's going to happen when we die? Is there anything else out there? And most importantly, perhaps, does it care about us? Right? I don't think those are religious questions. I call those properly human questions, because we ask them because they are a function of our humanity, not our adherence or membership in this or that faith community. We ask those questions whether we are religious or not. Now, religions claim to have answered them, and in worst case scenarios, answered them for everybody else. But they are properly human questions. And I think that's where looking at horror, looking at popular culture, looking at science fiction, this is where my sort of métier is. I get to look at this because it's looking at properly human questions through the lens of the religious imagination working itself out in real time. If that makes any sense. So I think the next slide is Scream. The Scream. There we are. Many of you may remember this. Wes Craven's Scream, 1996, a riff on all things horror. Only succeeded, I think, by Cabin in the Woods a few years ago. But one of the things that I love about this movie is that it very accurately reflects something that happens at this time of year countless times all over the world. Groups of friends gather together around a couch and they start watching a horror movie, and they're sharing popcorn and beer and pops and all the rest of it, and they're mocking the movie, and some of them are cowering and some of them are laughing, probably to hide their own sort of flinch response. But in Scream, there is this great scene where they're watching John Carpenter's Halloween, and Michael Myers is, busy stabbing his way through this Mr. Stabby out, and he's stabbing his way through a group of young people who look amazingly like the ones watching the screen. And Matthew Lillard, who is in fact the serial killer in that movie, leans in. He goes, "When do we see tits?" And they look at him. He says, "I want to see Jamie Lee's tits." Jamie Lee Curtis was the star of Halloween. And she says, "I came here to see Jamie Lee's tits." And Jamie Kennedy who is sort of the uber fan and repository of all things Halloween, says, no, 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 we don't see that until Trading Places. And Matthew Lillard's very disappointed. And Jamie Kennedy points out a very important thing. He says, Jamie Lee was a virgin through all of the horror movies. That's why she survived in the end. And they all kind of look at him, and he goes, wait. You don't know the rules? He stops the movie, and there's Michael Myers with Mr. Stabby. He stops the movie, and he goes up and he stands in front. He says, right, there are certain rules that you have to abide by if you want to survive a horror movie. And the first of those rules is don't have sex. That has become such a trope in horror movies. I mean, slasher movies going back decades. Who are the first people that get killed off? The people who have sex. It's almost like it's a punishment for doing the one thing they want to do most when they go to some cabin in the woods. Because sex is our most, I'm not saying that it's anything that's controversial here. Sex is our most powerful primal urge. Far more than hunger, far more than, breeding is not an autonomic response. We will give up sleep for it. We will give up almost anything in our lives to follow the object of sexual desire. All you need to do is look around to see that. It is the thing that drives us. Now, it's also what, in terms of what Sigmund Freud called our polymorphous perversity, the thing that we have sought to relentlessly control and contain. Yes, there are traditions, there are religious traditions that determine that you can not eat certain things or not eat certain things at certain times. There are religious traditions that say you can dress a certain way, but not dress another way. Yes, but there is no single human primal urge that religions have sought to control in such a way as sex. There's a couple of reasons for that. Sex is supposed to, the body, when you're in the body, it takes you away from God. Sex is considered animalistic. It's considered that which takes you away from the divine, especially, my God, specialty of sex outside of marriage. Or you masturbate. Consider something, though. There are lots and lots and lots of cultures around the world that have sex differently than people around here do. I'm sorry to tell you that happens to be true. If you think about sort of the myths and legends of a variety of other religious traditions, sex is everywhere in the divine realm. So we've tried to contain it. We've tried to put it in a little box. We've tried to control it. We have tried to keep bodies in their proper place. Women can't go into a certain part of the Second Temple. Second Temple Judaism, there's a court of the women. You don't go any further. There's a court for people who weren't Jews. There was a court for women. Only men can go further in. I don't have to elaborate any more than that, right? There are lots of traditions where women cannot serve in religious leadership, even though one of the things sociologists have known for quite some time is that it does not matter what religious tradition you look at. Women are more religious than men. We don't know why. There are lots of theories, but we don't know why that is. But that sex has to be segregated, right? So what I'm looking at in this book is the way sex, horror, and the religious imagination all come together. And I'm not limiting myself to sexual behavior, although that's part of it. I'm not limiting myself to sexual identity or gender identity. I'm not limiting myself to biology. I'm looking at any way that sex appears to be represented within horror. And that can be something as much as the naked body. Because for many, many millions of people, the naked body is not just a naked body. It is tied intimately, no pun intended, to an idea of sex. You cannot be naked apart from sex, apart from thinking about sex. So I'm sort of looking at a wide variety of different things and asking that question, wait, don't you know the rules? Don't have sex. So what I thought I would do, I mean, I decided I wasn't going to, this is the part of, this will be the adult part of the program. The first sort of vignette that I talk about in the book, and I don't have an image for it, I'm sorry, is what many, many people consider the most disturbing image from William Friedkins' The Exorcist. Sure, there's the backward spider walking, but that came out in the 2000 re-edit. Sure, there's the spinning of the head and the pea soup, but you know, those are special effects that don't really hold up very well. The scene that almost universally shocks people more than anything else brings the notion of sex, horror, and the religious imagination together in 4 words. Let Jesus fuck you. This is the crucifix masturbation scene. Now, if you read William Peter Blatty's novel, it takes far longer to read that one paragraph out loud than it does to watch that scene on film. That scene is about 3 and a bit seconds, about 78 or 80 frames. It's actually over like that. Out of a movie whose runtime is what, 2 hours and 14 minutes, something like that, 75 or 80 frames. And that's what people remember. Because, as William Friedkin said in one of the commentaries on this scene, he said, you are never supposed to see the crucifix and the vagina together. It's just not done. That's what makes this scene horrific. So when I started thinking about this and started thinking, okay, well, what does this say? You know, people interpret that scene differently. I mean, psychologists, I read one psychologist who, one sort of really sort of over the top Freudian, who said, what's going on really is the fact that Reagan wants to have sex with her absent father. I'm like, what? You read 2 paragraphs down in this article, and he says, well, no. It's actually not just her. The fact that she uses a crucifix means that she wants to have sex with the Pope. This is the sort of thing tenure is designed to protect, because that's just, you can't watch that movie and take that away in any reasonable sense. But then you have other people say, well, no, it's what it is. It's a metaphor for the way the church has treated women. And sure, it can be that, absolutely. But then you get people who are themselves devout Roman Catholics, who look at that movie as a package and go, Father Karras wins in the end, God wins in the end, the demon is defeated. This is in fact a validation of the faith that we hold. So not only is religion always and everywhere perspectival, but the way we approach these kind of horror texts is also perspectival. It's never just about what somebody is giving you on the screen or what somebody is giving you when you read a book. You are bringing a whole pot of assumptions, beliefs, experiences, fears, hopes, expectations, anxieties. You are bringing that to the experience of seeing something or reading something. It's what I call, it's the difference between, and this is what I'm trying to do in Bodies Out of Place, it's the difference between a riddle and an enigma. The problem, as I see it, and people are free to disagree, the problem as I see it is far too often when people like me, religious studies scholars, look at popular culture, whether it's science fiction or whether it's horror, or whether it's fantasy, or whatever it is they're looking at, they approach it as though it's a riddle. They just got to figure out what the metaphorical relationship is and they can solve the riddle. Well, this is actually a metaphor for emergent sexuality. This is actually a metaphor for something else. Great, we've solved the riddle. We now understand the film. That is probably the most superficial way to approach these things. My way, because riddles are asked certain of an answer. Nobody who asks, or nobody, when somebody says, hey, you want to hear a riddle? They already have the answer up here. They gatekeep the response. Enigmas are different. Enigmas are mysteries. Enigmas constantly invite us deeper and deeper and deeper into the text, whatever the text is, because whatever answer we get often raises different questions. So the questions that I had, and I'll share a few of them with you now, are, I need to just turn this other screen on for a second, have to do with enigmas. So Nancy, if you could put up that, I think it's called LDR, that's the one. Love, Death, and Robots. So I'm going to read and talk about a little bit the vignettes that I begin a couple of these different chapters with. And the first one is called Sacrificial Bodies. Now, Faustian bargains, as we know, rarely turn out well. Love, Death, and Robots is a Netflix anthology series of animated science fiction and short horror. And from post-apocalyptic tourism to special forces werewolves operating in Afghanistan to super intelligent breakfast food, these range from mordant humor to straight up body horror. Concluding the first series is this one. This is from Istvan Zarkozy's The Secret War. It's winter, 1943. Deep in the trackless wastes of the Siberian forest, a small squad of elite soldiers hunts an enemy that leaves only panic, gore, and devastation in its wake. This is not the aftermath of the German Blitzkrieg, nor the terrifying passage of SS Panzer divisions. This is not Germany invading Russia. This is something else, something much worse. Something they've been fighting since long before the savagery of Hitler's armies reached the motherland. For more than 2 decades, hordes of eldritch creatures have been pouring up from holes in the ground. Little more than teeth, sinew, and long razor-sharp claws, they hunger only for the kill. Immune to their own countless fallen in their endless pursuit of flesh. They are ghouls, as David Amendola, whose short story the film is based on, calls them. Now, as night falls, a small group of these Soviet soldiers huddle around a campfire. sharing a smoke, sharing what food they have. And they found a little notebook. And in the notebook are all these arcane symbols and passages. And one of them looks at the other and says, "Does it mean anything to you?" And he goes, "Yes, this is Operation Hades." Hades, the man explains, was an operation focused on exploring arcane peasant myths. The scene shifts to what you see on your screen now. This is told in flashback and voiceover. More than 2 decades earlier, during the Russian Civil War, as the White Army fell back before the advancing Bolsheviks, an intelligence officer named Grishin was dispatched on a secret mission. He was an occultist. His assignment was to perform certain black magic rituals whispered amongst the Kolyaks. It was meant to summon unholy creatures who would fight on the side of the Red Army. Now, all the popular trappings of occultism and black magic are present. Set deep in a dense forest, there's a torchlit ring of standing stones on a lonely cliff, hooded figures, their dark robes inscribed with esoteric symbols. They mutter and chant in the flickering light. And there is a woman, as we will see, or as I will write about in this chapter. There's almost always a woman. It's not always a woman, but almost always. Naked, she is suspended from ropes in the center of the circle, her arms crossed in front of her and raised above her head, her legs spread in what is obviously intended to have occult significance. Her head lolls, and at that point, we don't know whether she's alive or dead. The leader, his robe already stained with blood, approaches her and makes a series of small cutting motions. Then there's a shot of her torso, blood streaming from between her breasts, a complex symbol inscribed in her chest. The priest anoints Grishin with the dead woman's blood. The ritual apparently complete, the ground begins to crack around them and a large ghoul emerges. The first of those called forth from its hellish domain. The creature immediately turns on those who released it. It cannot be constrained and it will not be controlled. Grishin dies screaming, and the flashback ends, quote, "The operation doesn't seem to have worked out very well for him. Indeed, Faustian bargains rarely turn out well." Now, like the crucifix masturbation scene, what is important about this scene in the context of Netflix is, if you look at David Amendolo's short story on which this is based, the entire scene, that entire scene that I just described, is reduced to less than one sentence. Grishin had been assigned to perform black magic rituals in the Arctic to summon the ghouls. That's it. That's all. No mention of torchlit stones or mysterious hooded figures. These are the elements of the religious imagination. No hooded figures, no young women bound, mutilated, and offered by malevolent priests to unnamed gods. Yet in Philip Gellett's adaptation of that story for Netflix, her grisly sacrifice is central to the plot. It's the independent variable. It's the independent ritual variable in whatever dark millennium is supposed to be heralded by these ghouls. In fact, out of that film's 14-minute-ish running time, well over a minute is devoted to that sacrifice sequence. So actually, if you can bring up the Margaret Brundage slide now, please. There we are. We owe a lot of this. You think, well, what is this all about? Actually, this notion of sacrifice and the way sacrifice is presented here, the way it's ritualized as a function of the religious imagination, owes much of its power to a woman named Margaret Brundage. Margaret Brundage was one of the major cover artists for what is arguably one of the most popular and certainly the most influential of the horror pulps, a pulp called Weird Tales. She did more covers than anybody else, and her background was actually in fashion. After the Depression, she couldn't get a job in fashion, so she took her fashion portfolio around to these pulp publishers to see if she could get work drawing covers. She is the one who started this idea of the sexualized female sacrifice. And that is a trope that has continued in the same way, don't have sex. That's a trope that has continued throughout, right up through to Netflix. And it is another way of thinking about the way sex horror. I mean, think about the horror of human sacrifice for just a minute. I mean, seriously. Human sacrifice for many people is religion's dirty little secret. People don't want to talk about human sacrifice. You cannot understand the history of the human religious imagination without understanding our willingness to take the life of another in the service of our gods. Can you imagine anything more horrific than that? I see I've only got about 7 or 8 minutes, so I'm going to skip over one. I'm going to skip over nunsploitation. Nancy, could you put up? I think it's no, not that one. Skip past. There, that one. I'm going to skip over nunsploitation because I rambled. This is an image from a film, what I call a relentlessly depressing film called The Witch. It was released, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And what it is it's the story of a 17th century Puritan family who leaves this colony because the colony is not following the word of God the way they think it ought to be. They leave, and they literally leave civilization. They literally leave the protection of their community. And they go and they set up a homestead at the edge of the deep, dark forest. They are literally on the edge of the unknown. Now, this is the eldest daughter. Her name is Thomasin. And when we meet Thomasin, this is how she's dressed. Now, the way we see the different actors clothed in this film, the Puritans they wear their clothing almost as armor. Multiple layers of rough woolen and linen. Sure, it protects them from the harshness of the climate and the land, but it also protects them from the lure of the flesh, the sin that they regard as more egregious than anything else. In fact, the only time we see them not sort of entirely clothed, armored, as I put it, is when they have been in contact with the forest witch. This witch who steals one of their babies, kills him and grinds his bones for some sort of unholy paste. When the father goes looking for the other son, he comes back and he takes off his jacket and he's kind of washing himself, and his nakedness is a sign of weakness before the power of whatever lives in the forest. Now, the first time we see the forest witch, we see her kind of like a Red Riding Hood figure. She kind of flits through the trees. And then when we see her killing Sam, the young boy, the infant, she's more like Hans, the four witches of Hans Baldungrian. She's sort of basically, a badly packed sack of potatoes. And gradually, as we see her, she changes as her influence over the Puritan family grows. Finally, Thomason winds up shedding not only her Puritan beliefs, not only the safety of the faith she thought she believed in, but her clothes as well. Can you put up the next image, please, Nancy? This is actually the poster for the witch. This is supposed to be Thomason. This is one of the last scenes in the film. She is walking away from the camera towards not just one forest witch, but a group of forest witches who again, there's a lot of the imagery here has been taken from the art of people like Francisco Goya. And she's walking towards this in this highly sexualized way. This is about using sexuality as a way of identifying the dangerous religious other, right? Because if you look at her hands really closely, they're almost like claws, and you wonder sort of what sort of eldritch business is she going to be about. So I'm going to draw this to a close by doing two things. Again, I thank you for your patience and for your indulgence. This is the first time I've actually talked about this work, so it's a bit of a test drive that way. If I take you back to that, if I take you back to Scream, to the movie where Jamie Kennedy says, "Wait, you don't know the rules?" One of the other characters, just before he decides to explain the rules, says what I get asked probably in every interview I do about horror, probably in every, if it's not the first question, we're going to get to it before the end. And I'll quote the movie, "Why do we keep watching this shit over and over?" Which is to say, what is it about horror? What is it about the horrific story, the scary movie that we seem to be drawn to? And I think it's this. I don't know this, but this is the waypoint along in my thinking. I think it's this. Religion tells us the way things are, which is to say the way people who follow that particular religion believe them to be. Horror is constantly asking the questions, kind of like poking and prodding at those things and going, "Really? Are you sure? Do you think so? How do you know?" And more importantly, what if you're wrong? Because the one thing that is important to understand, one of the things that people, many people have written about horror and said why we like horror movies is to survive at the end. We feel the sense of relief that we've survived at the end. Really? If that's what you think, you haven't watched enough horror movies, and you certainly haven't watched enough transnational horror. You certainly haven't watched enough Japanese horror or Korean horror or Thai horror or Malaysian horror. You certainly haven't watched enough of that, because in that, the shit don't end. Things don't get better. And I think there's a reason for that. I think the reason for that is we may think we know the answers. We may think we have the answers, but we know that the darkness is still out there. We have this anxious uncertainty, this sense of ambivalence and ambiguity. We don't trust our answers. And I'm going to close. I want to read to you the very last paragraph from this book. Technology has not banished fear of the dark. Candles burn down, batteries go flat, and flashlights inevitably refuse to work just when we need them most. No matter how powerful our halogen headlights, the darkness and all the fears that live within it still exist on the ragged edge of the light we use to keep them at bay. Moreover, even while we keep it at bay, even as we use all our technological resources to pierce the darkness, we can still see it out there. We have, in fact, done nothing more than prick it. Because in the context of the pitifully small segment of the electromagnetic spectrum to which we have visible access, darkness is our natural condition. Light is the intruder, a temporary island of relative security in a larger, largely uncharted ocean of dark. I want to thank you all for joining me, those who stayed through till the end. Maybe some of you didn't want to or weren't able to, or didn't seem like it was what you expected it to be. So I guess that's all I want to say. Thank you again for inviting me.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you so much, actually, for coming. That was awesome. I see that there are some comments along the side that somebody is saying that that was awesome.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry about that. So I can see that there are some comments here. Somebody had said that this was awesome tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And I wanted to thank Renison and the partnership for coming and always coming with really interesting topics. That was really fantastic tonight and so timely. Right before Halloween, horror culture. Who doesn't love horror culture?
Yeah, I get to read horror books and call it work. I let other people that I work with do real work.
And I'm just going to open it up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, you're just welcome to put that into the chat. There is also a Q&A section that's just down at the bottom. And if you wanted to ask any questions, you're welcome to do that right now. And we'll just give it a couple minutes for some questions to come through.
Sure. What I never got to talk about was nunsploitation. That's a whole other topic.
Did you want to talk about that a little bit just while we wait for people to?
Well, yeah. Well, okay. No, here we go. Here, if I'm recalling, I want to give over time if people have comments or questions.
Okay. And can you see the? I'm
just going to turn the. Yeah, I can see the chat. If I'm recalling, last book you wrote correctly in your America's Dark Didn't speak at length about how Stephen Captain taps into the unknown, of death and spirituality. Do you see that as a common theme in horror? One of the things that Stephen King does in what I talk about in terms of the unknown is it's often easy to try and figure out what an author or a filmmaker means by a film, right? And what Stephen King does, in my view, is wherever we think we have some secure ground, some secure footing to stand, he's always there going, really? Really? Check this shit out, right? He's right there going every time we think, and you think about horror as a sense of, well, we can get out alive. Like you think of something like his novel, The Stand, which is 300 pages too long. But people often write about that as his most religious novel. I don't think it is. I mean, not by a long shot. His most religious novel, in my view, is a novel called Desperation. But when you think about a movie or a novel like Under the Dome, where you have ordinary people, they're cutting their lawn, they're going to church, some are good, some are bad, and all of a sudden this dome comes down and cuts them off from the world. That book is particularly interesting in terms of the unknown, because nobody gets out of that book alive, in the sense of nobody comes out better off than they were when they went in. So in terms of what the unknown, what I was saying in America's Dark Theologian, is every time Stephen King is always using horror as a way of undermining whatever it is we think we know to be true. I hope that makes sense, Sharon. Yay. I like it when I make sense. What I was going to say about I don't know if we're in a mode where you can flip that. Remember the image you had, the Convent of Hell image that I told you to flip past? If we're in a mode where you can throw that up, that's great. I can say a few words about that if people want. That ought to annoy people. There we go. This is a graphic novel. Again, I get to read graphic novels and call it work. This is a graphic novel by two Argentinians artists. This is the English translation from a French publisher called the Convent of Hell. And basically it builds on popular conceptions of what goes on behind convent walls that have been in circulation since at least the time of Chaucer. If you read Chaucer, if you read the Nun's Priest's Tale, if you read Chaucer's Italian Confederate, Boccaccio, you see the same thing. This idea that somehow sexuality, especially female virginity, is in fact a religious resource that has to be shielded and has to be protected. And of course, by the 19th century, the notion of what really happens inside convents, that they're all worshiping the devil, that they're I mean, I have books on my shelf from that are actually, I have original copies actually from the 19th century of all of these books that detail the most lurid sort of stories of what's happening, what the truth behind what happens in a convent, right? And it's all about devil worship, and babies are being born and buried in tunnels that join underground tunnels that join the convent with the monastery, and they're all actually worshiping the devil. And as much as anything, it's all about sex. Because when you try to constrain the flesh, when you try to keep that primal urge in and in check, it will find a way out. Can you put that pinhead image up again, please, Nancy? There we go. Hey, buddy. Nice to see you again. In another of the Hellraiser movies, he has these great lines. And in another of these Hellraiser movies, he confronts a guy who basically, he's an abuser. He abuses women, and basically Pinhead tries to get him, the Hell Priest tries to get him to sort of join him as a Cenobite. And this guy's name is Monroe, says, no, man, I don't want to do that. I mean, I just do my thing. And I mean, what you do, man, that's just evil, man. And again, Doug Bradley looks at him and he says, there is no good. There is no evil, Monroe. There is only flesh. So when we think about, in terms of my way of sort of processing through these things, when we think about the religious imagination and the unseen order, we don't have to look at that and go, well, that doesn't look like any religion I know. That's the value of William James. We can actually take something like that and go, in the context of the way the unseen order works for this character, this is how the universe works. It doesn't care about us. It does not have our best interests in mind. It is at best indifferent to us. In fact, it would be better if it were indifferent to us, because all of a sudden, when we read texts like this, I mean, a text like this one, I think it's probably backwards because of the way the screen is. When you read any of the horror novels that I have on my shelves or any of the horror movies, what we're looking at is the religious imagination at work in real time. That's the way I think about it. It is it's asking those properly human questions. For somebody like Pinhead, when we ask the question, that's a properly human question. When we ask the question, does the universe care about us? His answer is, hell no. Hell no, it don't. You'd be way better off if it didn't care, if it was just indifferent. I mean, when we ask questions of why do we suffer, Pinhead's answer is because. So there are a variety of ways of thinking about all of this. And since I am, in fact, sorry, I let go of my mic. When I started this project, I do what I always do, and what I teach my graduate students. And if I have graduate students watching, you're going to recognize this. When I say to graduate students, if you want to become an expert on something, how many books on that topic do you have to read? And the answer is all of them. I mean, you'll get to the point where you don't have to read all of them. You'll recognize when you don't have to read all of them. But I started reading, and you know what I found? For all the sort of the array of material that one finds about religion and horror, there are relatively few books written about it. There is not a single book written about sex, religion, and horror. Not one. There's a book on sex in the horror film, which isn't very good actually, but there's our occasional articles. But this is the first book that brings all of these three together. And that's kind of exciting for me in one and kind of terrifying in the other, because there's no roadmap to follow. It's easy for me to point out where other people are making mistakes, but I'm making all kinds of them myself. Again, any more questions? Oops, wrong mouse. Oh, here we go. You presented sex and horror as heteronormative in the way it is in horror films. Do you intend something else? I have a limited horror repertoire, mostly slasher films. If you have a limited horror repertoire, mostly slasher films, then yeah, it is going to be heteronormative. But there are a number of chapters that I didn't actually get to talk about. One of which is, in fact, a chapter that looks at sex and the religious imagination as a function of the alien body, which is sort of Lovecraftian horror. So we have oops, sorry, I just zoomed you. So we have movies like, it's a fun movie, Call Girl of Cthulhu, where a young woman is actually she becomes the vessel for the birth of Cthulhu, which is sort of a riff on the virgin birth. But there is all kinds of transgender horror. Transgender horror is huge, especially in Malaysia, which is odd. I don't know why. I haven't figured out what the answer to that is. There's a lot of non-heteronormative horror you find in that I'm going to talk about in a chapter that I call the Sadian body, about Sadian philosophy and horror. And one of the things that's important to understand about horror, and I didn't get to talk about this in the Witch, is that however horror presents sex is generally a problem. So horror is often considered, it's often talked about as a very conservative genre, and in the West, that's certainly true. That it's about representing non-dominant values as a problem, making them horrific. So, I mean, one of the things about, you know, in the Convent of Hell chapter, very, very little of that is actually heteronormative. It's actually mostly lesbian relationships that are going on within the walls of the convent. So the issue of heteronormativity is a good one. It's just, you can only say so much in 45 minutes. Debashus. Where's Debashus? Could religion make sex unhorrific? Oh, that's a good question. And if you remember a movie called The Wicker Man, not the Nicolas Cage version, about which we will speak no more, but the original Robin Hardy film, that film mostly takes place from the point of view of Neil Howie, the police sergeant who has come to this island, this island off the Hebrides, to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. And, you know, he flies in, he sees the villagers, they don't go out to meet him, he has to call them. He is almost constantly sort of coming in, and this is an island of pagans, modern pagans, and we're trying to revive the old gods and the old traditions, and many of which have to do with the positive value of sexuality. And the way the movie sort of portrays this, because it's portrayed from Neil Howie's perspective, is he's a staunch Anglican, high church Anglican. He's horrified by all of this sexiness around him. He's horrified by the maypole. He's horrified by young girls and boys jumping naked over the bonfire at Samhain. He's horrified by all of this stuff. He's horrified by the notion of the male and the female principle brought together in what modern pagans call the Great Rite. Right? He's horrified by this. And one of the most powerful scenes is actually, he's in his room in the pub, and the daughter, who is, I think, played by Elkie Summer, she is on the other side of the door, and she wants to come in and seduce him. And he's crouched down, and he's muttering his prayers, and he's not letting her in, and it's just not going to happen. And most people, when they write about that, look at that and go, isn't that horrible? That terrible, sexy pagan woman is trying to corrupt that good Christian police officer. Well, says Doug, how about if we look at it from a different perspective? How about if we look at it from the perspective of Willow, Elkie Summer's character? From her perspective in terms of the religious imagination, from her religious imagination, she is doing the very thing that her gods demand. She is doing the very thing that she believes he needs to be set free from this constraining, torturous understanding of sexuality that he has. So for Debashus, that's a way of thinking about making sex unhorrific. Sex is very rarely the answer in horror, but it is occasionally. There's a movie on, I have Netflix, obviously. I also have Shudder, and I'm a talking head actually on Shudder in a couple of episodes of Cursed Films, so that's fun, and a shameless plug. But there's also there's a streaming service called Tubi, Tubi. It's free. There are literally hundreds of horror movies on there. But on Shudder right now is a film called Luciferina. And basically it is, it's a basic possession story, but at the end, what it is that sets the main characters free, if you will, that sort of saves them, is the fact that they have sex. So the girl who was planning on being a nun and was a virgin and was planning on being a virgin forever, has sex with the boy, the young man, in front of the altar, and that's what actually solves the problem. Now, it's not a great movie, but it's one of the few times that sex actually solves the problem of the film. I had trouble getting on, so if I missed this at the beginning, the No Way Out description for some of the international horror scenes seems American horror likes the idea of redemption. Absolutely. For better or worse engagement. Yeah, it's a good question, Sharon. Does the idea of No Way Out make for better or worse engagement? I think it depends on, I think that depends on cultural context. You know, the best example I can think of, or the one that comes to mind off the top of my head, is Ju-On. When I teach religion and horror film, I regularly show the film Ju-On, which students tell me later is the one that scares them witless. Now, Ju-On is interesting. Ju-On literally means it's like a grudge. It's somebody dies in such traumatic circumstances that their spirit cannot move on. In this case, it's a young woman named Kayako and her son Tomiko. Now, Ju-On, made for Japanese audiences, is told episodically, and the episodes are out of order. There is no sort of narrative arc. There's no beginning, no middle, no end. There's no sense that things come to closure. It's just shit goes on, right? When Ju-On came to the United States, it got panned. Nobody liked it. I mean, people liked it because it's a horror movie, but I mean, it just got panned because North American audiences were used to this narrative arc that brings closure and we feel good at the end. Whereas Ju-On just doesn't have that. They were left saying things like, there are some bad things happen when people go in the house, but I don't understand why they do. That's because you don't understand the Japanese context. Now, what's interesting about Ju-On is that it was reshot and released a year later for North American audiences as a movie called The Grudge, starring Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Sarah Michelle Gellar. Now, there are a few things that are different about these two, and this is why it's interesting to compare. Because the essence of comparison is not pointing out similarities, it's in explaining differences. When Ju-On is shot in a very claustrophobic way, you're turning, you can't escape from things. When Kayako comes down the stairs, it's like there's just nowhere to go. You turn, it's very claustrophobic. And the jump cuts and the way the different scenes are arranged don't ever give you purchase on kind of a narrative, on a way of understanding the narrative. When it was reshot for North American audiences, Sarah Michelle Gellar, who's quite tiny, there's a lot of long and medium shots of her in great crowds in Tokyo. And she's trying to find her way to the house where she's supposed to go, and she doesn't speak the language, and there's all these people. So in the Japanese version, it's all about claustrophobia. In the American version, it's all about this sense of being strangeness of environment, right? So there's also, in the American version, all kinds of explanations for things no Japanese person would ever have to have explained to them. That's two. Third thing is it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, The Grudge has done okay over here. The Grudge has done okay over here. Ju-On just blows the gates off. Ju-On is a phenomenon in Japan. So the idea of understanding horror in its cultural context, for example, Indonesian horror is almost always about ghosts, no matter what sort of the presenting issue is. Is it a demon? Is it a witch doctor? Is it this? Is that? It almost always comes down to the notion of ghosts, because all kinds of cultures live with ghosts as closely as we live with the people around us. They're a part of the furniture of everyday life. So it's why this book is actually taking me a little bit longer to finish than I had hoped, because to be honest, I had this whole theory set up, and then I started watching Indonesian horror and Malaysian horror and Korean horror and Japanese horror and talked myself out of half of the theory that I'd already set up. So there was 15,000 words down the frickin' tube. But I think it's going to be better. I think it's going to be better for that, because I feel like I have a better grasp of what's going on. Here's my big regret. The big regret is I have to rely on subtitles, because I don't speak any Indonesian language. I don't speak Malaysian. I don't speak Tagalog. I don't speak Chinese. I don't speak Korean. I don't speak Japanese. I have to rely on subtitles. So those of us who try to work in transnational horror, now, I mean, the same is true. I've read articles by Japanese scholars talking about North American films that they saw in subtitles, and if they'd been able to understand the English, you know, they would have had a better understanding. But that's my big regret. So what we got here, Zach, dude, would you say more modern horror like The Witch portrays sex and religion in a more positive light? I don't. Yeah. The problem with The Witch and sex positivity is I'm not quite sure how you can watch that movie and get there. I'd like to see the argument. I've seen the arguments that people say, well, it's a feminist narrative. I'm not sure how they get there, and maybe it's just the fact that I'm a man. I don't know, but let's be clear about what we know about The Witch. Is she took an infant and she killed him and she ground him up to make paste to rub on her body. So there's that. I mean, I think people can try and make the arguments that they want, and that's why I'm hoping that maybe books like this will spark some kind of debate about these things, because there sure as hell hasn't been going on so far. I mean, one of my favorite, when you're a full professor, you can do stuff like this. One of my favorite moments, and I was talking about sacred terror. I was giving a lecture on sacred terror. It was actually at the American Academy of Religion. And there was a person in the audience who kept challenging me on why I didn't look at this movie, why I didn't look at this movie, why I didn't look at this series of movies. And finally I said, you know, it sounds to me like you're upset because I didn't write the book you would have written if you were writing about religion and horror. And the person said, yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. I said, then write your own goddamn book. You know, seriously. I mean, if you think I'm writing these things to have the last word on the topic, you have not been paying attention. Okay, so I get what people say about The Witch. I can sort of see why they might, but I can't get there on my own. Yeah, go tenure. I think are we coming up on 8:30 there?
Oh, so we're just at 8:30 right now.
Amy. So is that where we end?
Yeah. So it's that time. It's that time to wrap it up. I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank Renison for the partnership. Always really great topics, but really, especially interesting one tonight. It was fantastic and really good questions too.
It was. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I hope, let's see, we still have 20 people left, so I only scared off 35. That's not bad. So I guess you'll close things out. Thank you everybody for coming, and watch more scary movies.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Have a good night, everyone.